In this video, the middle-aged nerds discuss spoilers from books they read decades ago. Do you really need a spoiler alert? Do you really?
Hello, folks, and welcome back to Non-Terrestrial Half-Life. I'm Bill, otherwise known as Matt Stagger, and here we take books we read in the first half of our life and we reread them and see if they stand the test of time or if it's just nostalgia that we remember loving. My co-host today, Glenn.
Hey there, I'm the Geeky Hippie. Welcome back. We've got a guest this week as we kick off a new book trilogy. We're starting with Raymond Feist's Magician. But we have, like I said, we have a guest. Want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nyniamh King, otherwise known as Nyniamh Sedai or Nimpkins on Twitter. My name is actually Irish, Niamh. The MH actually makes the V sound, which gives it the Nyniamh or the Neve in Nyniamh. So that's why my username is Nyniamh Sedai. So
awesome. We are really happy to have you here for this series.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I feel like it's a real privilege to have had this opportunity to come join you guys and talk about what is one of my favorite books.
I was glad to find somebody who was a fan of these books. So we are on to Raymond Feist's Rift War saga. First book of which is Magician. Sometimes in America, you'll see it published as Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. We're discussing it as one book. That's how I read it the first time. Nyniamh,
like, yeah,
Nyniamh.
The audiobooks were split in two for me, so.
Oh, were they?
Oh.
Yeah.
Mine weren't. I managed to get one that wasn't.
Yeah, it was all one book for me when I was listening to it last week. So
I've kicked it out twice this year. I was going to listen to it again starting Monday, and then I'm like, I've already listened to it twice this year, on top of who knows how many times I've read it in the past. So Nyniamh, when did you first discover you love books? What books led to that, and do you have any idea how old you were?
I was quite young. I was definitely quite young. We were a book household. So my dad was a big reader and my mum was big readers. So there was always books around. My older sisters are much older than me. So the books that they had as kids ended up being handed down to myself, my sister, and my brother when we came along. So we had those books. But I do have a very early memory of, I don't know if you guys remember getting the books with the little cassettes when you were kids.
So I was a little bit too old for that.
It was a rarity that we got them, but we did get them.
We could buy them in our local supermarket, but they were a very big treat, and they're only bought on special occasions. But I always remember one called Dennis the Dragon. So obviously my love of dragon stories started off quite young when I was about 4 or 5. Yeah. So, and then, we had the Ladybird books, the classic Ladybirds, and then a big love for Enid Blyton. Love Enid Blyton. She was just such a fun writer to read as a kid. She created all these magical worlds you could just skate to. Like Faraway Tree and the Wishing Chair, and all her little stories about brownies and things like that. So big influence on my love for fantasy.
I think my influence for fantasy came probably from C.S. Lewis. I was introduced to the Narnia stuff fairly young age, a little bit older than when I started reading a lot, but I don't remember much of what I read before that. Because I was probably 6 or 7 when I started reading Chronicles of Narnia. That's what it was for me.
They're brilliant books.
My reading of Xanth by Pierce Anthony, and I was obsessed with Westerns, so I was reading a lot of Louis L'Amour. And my dad noticed I was reading fantasy and Westerns, and I couldn't have been 13, and he handed me Stephen King's The Gunslinger. And he's like, this is both. This is fantasy and a Western. And that blew my mind. And I think that was the moment I realized I actually love reading. I read before that, but
You just didn't love it as much.
Well, yeah, I didn't really use it as a pleasure activity. It was more of a boredom activity. So from that point on, I was like, no, I love books.
So do you guys remember the first time you read Magician by Raymond Feist?
I'd say I was around 20. I think I was working as an archaeologist at the time, and I just devoured a good chunk of Terry Brooks' Shannara Chronicles. So I was, there was books that hadn't come out yet, so I needed something to fill the gap.
Right.
And I read the blurb at the back of Magician. I went, no, this sounds really interesting. So I picked it up and fell in love. So about 20 years ago now.
I think I was probably 13 or 14, I'm guessing. It was within a year or two probably of it first coming out, and I think it came out in like 83 or 84. I didn't write that down. I should have.
1982.
Yeah,
82,
I wrote it down.
okay. So might have been closer to 84, 85 for me. So 12, 13 years old. I like your tea mug. Teacup. I'm guessing that's tea, not coffee.
Oh, it's tea, yeah. Decaf, unfortunately. But yeah, tea.
Coffee.
I think I was 14 or 15 when I read it the first time, somewhere around that age. And I remembered really enjoying it, but I could not remember details when this came up on our list. I'm like, I remember Pug and a couple other small details, but I could not remember the story to save my life.
Wow. I've had that. That was what I went through when we were doing the Earthsea books. I remembered little bits, just little vague memories. And then rereading them this year was like a total discovery for me.
Well, that's how I feel about this series. I mean,
Yeah.
Especially coming off the last book we read that we did not enjoy. So,
Oh dear.
yeah,
Dragons
it
of
was.
Summer Flame was a flaming disaster.
Oh
Yeah.
dear.
So getting into
was-
this was just a breath of fresh air, and I pretty much devoured it, and I couldn't stop. So I immediately moved on to Silverthorn.
Same.
Oops.
Yeah. I've read the trilogy plus the first two Empire books before rereading Magician for it and ahead of doing this with you guys. And even that time, the second time reading Magician this year, it was like rediscovering it all over again. And that's the absolute love of what had made me fall in love with Raymond D. Feist's writing in the first place. So
I'm definitely looking forward to revisiting the Empire series trilogy. It's been a few years since I reread that one, but I do know Mara of the Akoma is my number 2 favorite female character in fantasy.
I think after reading the first two books, she's definitely up there for me.
And she does it
100%.
without
She's
magic
incredible.
or a weapon. You know, she does it
Yeah.
without doing magic or weapon, fighting. And that's what I love about it.
When you first read this book the first time, did it stand out to you? Do you remember particularly strong feelings towards it? And did it affect your reading choices afterwards?
You know what? It really, really did, because I think even though I'd read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit when I was younger, and then I'd read a lot of the Shannara Chronicles, I think it was Magician and the Rift War trilogy that really solidified my absolute love for fantasy. There was just something about it. It was the way he wrote, the way he created his worlds, all the worlds, his characterization. Everybody was so distinct. He used cultures, he picked people out of history, and he just had such a great grasp of being a storyteller that made every single element of the book just gripping. And you're constantly, there could be just looking at, I don't know, a tree, and it would feel completely gripping and make you want to keep reading about the tree, just absolutely really solidified it for me, and he led on to other writers like Trudy Canavan and so much more, and even influenced my own writing, so yeah, I think he was very important at the time in my early 20s in my development of reading quite a lot.
Yeah, I was very impressed with his ability to start the chapter in a certain way. It was always a description of a person and what, they were doing at that moment. But by the end of the chapter, it always led to, oh my God, I need more. So every time you would go to the next chapter and it wasn't that particular character, I'd be like, oh man. But at the same time,
Disappointing.
you would move into somebody else who was extremely interesting, so.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Jumping from
think-
Marutha to Thomas was frustrating yet gratifying at the same time.
It was
I
always
think one thing-
satisfying once it went back to Pug, though.
Well, yeah.
Yes. I do prefer the elves in Mid-Camia, well, the Rift War saga, over Tolkien's elves, if that's not too heretical to say.
Oh, that sounds like heresy, but I kind of can't help but agree. They're just more interesting, and there's just more background and depth, and they don't just feel ceremonial, they feel like actual living human or living beings with everything, emotions, so much more than you get with Tolkien. I feel like I should bless myself after that.
No, I think you're both 100% right, and I don't think it's blasphemy to say that he did an elf differently that was actually more satisfying and better. I don't think that's blasphemy at all. Like I said, they strongly reminded me of the Celtic elves, the two I always have trouble. Thank you, Tuatha De Danann.
Don't ask me to say it right.
I definitely got that feel from them where they felt a little more alive, a little more connected to the earth, which I think is what brings that in.
They don't feel as, I know Tolkien's elves aren't the angels, but Tolkien's elves feel more angelic. Like they're not of the world, even though they very much are. I know it's the Maiar who are the equivalent of angels, but Tolkien's elves just seemed above living beings, to me.
They do have that ethereal, they have that kind of ethereal beingness about them and the otherworldliness, which you do get in Irish mythology and European mythology as well. But yeah, I totally get where you're coming from, but I do feel, as we've said, that the ones from Rift War saga are just more grounded. They're just more believable, I think.
I think they're more of the world than other elves in other systems. The other elves seem there in the world, but they're not really participating in the world, is what it feels like.
This is also the first fantasy world first series that I read that had a very alien world. We're used to, in this day and age, we're used to Brandon Sanderson. His fantasy worlds are very alien compared to what we're used to, especially, Roshar with Stormlight Archive series, where it's like a different tree of life, entirely. And that's what we see here on Kelowon when we go through the rift to the other side.
Yes.
The majority of species are hexapods instead of bipedal or quadruped, from the Nidra to the Choja. It's a very different non-earth analog of a world that we get with Kelowon.
I love the fact that they were relatable. I mean, they're sort of viewed as the bad guys at first, but as we get to know them, we realize some of them don't want this war either.
No.
This has become political more than anything else. So I love the fact they were relatable, and there were plans in place for people who were trying to stop the war. I mean, yeah, it's one of the first times, given when it came out, around that time, that I could remember bad guys being sort of not really bad.
I totally get what you're saying, but
Yeah.
you can also relate to them because they're like picked out of history. You kind of get a Roman feel about their culture as well as being blended with a bit of Japanese culture.
Yeah,
So
samurai got a lot of that.
Yeah. So you've got the samurai and the Roman kind of blended together, and you feel like you can relate because you know, if you know anything about Roman history, you know how tactical they were and how everything was political and everything was like a game of, game of the council,
Yeah.
So you could relate to that as well because it's no different to, nowadays when politics is so tit for tat and I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So I found that made them very realistic, even though they were the aliens, So
In a very real way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always kind of thought of the Tsaranoani as like one part Japanese or East Asian, one part Klingon, and one part Aztec. It just, the way that they dressed was where the Aztec came from.
You
But,
just had to throw the
whole-
Star Trek in there, didn't you?
There's a very Klingon aspect to them, in my opinion. Just the Klingon Empire is not that far off from the Empire of Saranwani. I mean, death before dishonor, warlike, and heavy politics. Kind of sounds to me like what we got, my teenage and 20s on Star Trek, Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine, just focusing on the Klingons that much. So I thought,
I think there was a lot of sort of samurai culture brought into there. The whole, once they made a transgression to a certain point, their only recourse was basically seppuku.
Yeah.
They had to end their own lives. And I definitely picked up on that being a major theme. And at the end, when some of them get stuck here, you're sort of stuck with that moment where you're like, oh my God, they're all going to kill themselves. And you're scared for them. And you're like,
yeah,
you remind yourself, these are the bad guys, sort of. But at the same time, you're like, I really like them. And I don't want that to happen.
No, you get to really love
Especially
Kasumi,
Yeah.
Yeah, you get to love him. So
Kasumi is
and
great.
yeah, and his whole family, you just realize that they're such good people and they've got, they really want to learn and they really want to just be at peace. So you kind of can't help but love them all. They're like little squishy.
So we know you love Kasumi. Who would you say was your favorite character in this series? If not
Pug.
Kasumi and Pug.
It's 100% Pug. Can't not be Pug. He's like the best. He's to me, he's always been one of my all-time favorite characters. Even if I'd managed to somehow completely forget all about Thomas's existence.
Yeah, me too.
Between reads. Oh my God.
Thomas is too awesome to forget.
Terrible. Pug has always lived in my head as one of my all-time favorite literary fantasy characters.
Definitely one of the best wizards.
Yeah.
He's definitely on my
without a
top 10 wizards list.
Yeah.
I think for me, my first time reading it, it was definitely Pug. Because he's the only one I really remembered and remember the aspects. So he stuck with me and I have fond memories of him. I got to say this time, Amos was my favorite. Amos Trask always cracked me up, but at the same time was so vital.
He's brilliant. I have the same thing.
I love that name too. Amos Trask is just.
Or Captain Trenchard, Dagger of the Sea. I love the sound of that.
Oh, I'm with you 100%. He really just came to life, I think, in the second and third read for me. And he was another character I'd completely forgotten about. And then
me too.
When the scene where they're in the harbor and the boats, being attacked and all that, and it's about to blow up, I straight away went, oh my God, it's the pirate guy. I didn't remember his name, but I was like, I remember him, kind of, I think.
I think my favorite character, I always had and really enjoyed Arutha Condoin a lot. He's one of my favorite, especially political leaders in fantasy. But I think it's the one who's kind of sort of his protege, and we get more of him going in further into these books. We barely got him in this book.
Yeah.
Jimmy the Hand.
Gotta love Jimmy.
I love Jimmy the Hand. And over Jimmy's entire storyline through the rest of these books, I love the character of Jimmy, James of Crondor. He's probably, I don't know, it must be telling that in this he's my favorite character, and in Dragonlance Tasselhoff's my favorite character. I must really like the rogues or something, I'm guessing, because I mean the two biggest rogues, in each series, they're my favorite character.
What things had you forgotten about that, surprised you either pleasantly or unpleasantly when you picked the book up again?
Unpleasantly, I'd completely forgotten about the Mad King.
Yeah, me too. And that was rough.
Yeah, that was rough going. It was like, I think you can obviously he's highly influenced by George III, I reckon, in his madness. But I'd completely forgotten all about him. And part of me was like, I kind of wish he wasn't in it. But I know that's terrible. But there was so much I'd forgotten about. I forgot about Laurie. And I love Laurie. He's just such a great character. And it's like, how can you forget such a great character like Laurie? He's just great, as we'd say, like in Ireland, he's great crack, So,
right.
I'd forgotten so much. It'd been 20 years since I'd read it. So Arutha and Pug were the two elements of the book that I'd remembered the most. Culgan and Meacham, I'd forgotten about them, and they've got a whole new place in my heart now after the reread.
For some reason, I always forget about Fantas.
Yeah,
the fire drake.
He's just cute.
Yeah. How I can forget about such an adorable little mini dragon, I don't know. I'm so obsessed with Anne McCaffrey's fire lizards. Somehow I forget about the fire drake in this series. So
I forgot all about Thomas and the dragon and finding the armor, and I forgot all about that arc completely.
Same.
So I was engrossed with him and what was going on with him, and hoping he can fight back to this tide of this other will being imposed on him.
I definitely think the Valheru are one of the greatest inventions Feist had with this series. They're just
but brutal.
These dragon lords are just a fascinating idea. And that I hadn't seen anything like them. I don't think I've seen anything quite like the Valheru in other fantasy at all yet. So he has a lot of tropes that he pulled from fantasy. I mean, we've got your elves and the dwarves, we've got goblins, I think he's the first person to do dark elves.
The Dark Brothers were really good. It's such a great addition to think that there's different types of elves. There's goods, there's bads, there's the weird ones hiding in the forest who completely forgot anybody else existed. I know that's darkness that's setting on, but but the Dark Brotherhood, they're a bit twisty.
I do wonder how many other fantasists can point back to this series or this author as somewhat of an inspiration for some of the stuff they wrote.
I don't think it's just what he wrote. I think it's how he wrote it that made it so engaging. And I mean, he sort of took those tropes, but at the same time, his writing style sort of mastered it, and it made it look effortless while he was doing it.
I do think this is definitely the first fantasy series based on a game setting that the author had played in. There's another massive fantasy series out there, a much more recent one, with 2 authors where they're doing that. That's the Malazan Book of the Fallen, or all the Malazan books. Some people may
I've
not
heard
know.
of, yeah, I've heard of
Steven
them. People,
Erickson and Ian Siasamat, they used to game in the setting that they're writing about. So it originally was a game setting, and that's what this was. I think the time period they played in before he started writing these books was about 500 years into the future of where we're at with these books. He covers a good chunk of that history over the next 20 some odd books, the 30 book series. I really love the D&D aspect, the standard typical European fantasy setting that we get with Midkemia or Midkemia, however you want to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Kind of missed having orcs, but goblins are good enough, I guess, and depending on
dark elves. Who needs orcs when you can have the Dark Brotherhood, know?
Yeah.
And
What were the creatures called? The
which one's
Serrani.
Shoja.
The Choja.
Yeah. So I mean they're pretty close. I mean they're more
Yeah.
insectoid, but I mean story wise and the way they operate and everything, I'd say they're pretty close to,
Just
orcs.
wait until you read more.
I am.
They're not.
Patiently,
Yeah.
sort of.
Wait till you get to the Empire trilogy. I love the Chocha and the
Yes.
Empire trilogy. They're
Ooh,
brilliant.
that should be fun. That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Empire trilogy, I think, is actually my favorite stuff Feist has written. I just wonder how much of that is me liking what Janny Wirtz wrote, or I don't know how. I have not read anything else of hers.
I think he needed Janie Wirtz to help him write it because, and I have it written on my notes, he's not really that great at writing female characters. So
True.
And
Yes.
I think she was necessary for the Empire trilogy, especially seeing as the main character and the main
As a
protagonist as a woman. And I think
Yeah.
she brought so much femininity into that book that he just could not get in Magician.
So how has your life experience sort of changed your perspective on the books since you're a little older when you read them this time? Did that happen at all for you?
Do you know what? I think my life experience is in a sense that since I read those books, I actually did a degree in creative writing, and that made me learn an awful lot more about the skill process and all the type of elements that are important when writing novels or poems or plays or even screenplay. And when rereading, as we've mentioned before about the quality of his writing, rereading Magician showed me the quality of his writing and how skillful he is actually using proper writing tropes that you'd learn in a creative writing degree as being the best practices. Yes, he says, he said, she said, he said, she said an awful lot, but you get more encouraged more to say that rather than go, she giggled and he laughed out loud or
Right.
anything like that. It's you get told to stay away from that, but then to kind of explain the kind of emotions they're going through as they said, So I think that's what I really gained more of an appreciation of this time round in reading the books than I did the first time round, because other than being a lot older and a bit more mature, that kind of background with the degree gave me that better appreciation of the hard work he's put into that book. So
I
Yeah,
think one
I
difference.
agree.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, I agree. I don't think I appreciated the skill that he used to sort of perfect the tropes, where you barely notice their tropes unless you're really looking for it because it's so smoothly done.
yeah,
So yeah, I completely missed that on my first read. I'm sure I definitely noticed it this time, and it's just masterfully done. So
It's
I'm
beautifully
extremely
done.
happy.
I think one thing I've noticed for me in my reread this time was I actually do more adulting and understand adulting more than I ever thought I did. Because the kids in these series, I'm just like, how dense can they and oblivious can they be at times? It just, yeah, Jimmy's probably my favorite in this book, minor character, but Jimmy's kind of just a dumb kid, and Pug and Thomas were dumb kids, and Roland was definitely a dumb kid. And I
Oh,
didn't really get these characters until, this time around, until they were older, until we see them aged up. Even Caroline was just a dumb little brat for a while there too.
yeah.
Well,
Everybody,
understandable given her, how
yeah,
she was raised and everything. That's how a kid would act, and so it
yeah,
fits.
yeah, it does. But
And they're
yeah,
teenagers. Think about it. We were all dumb
Yeah,
teenagers at one
dude.
point. We all did stupid things, So in a way you can kind of relate to that.
I
yeah.
look back at some of my teenage years and I cringe at some of the stuff I was doing and saying, walking around like I knew everything.
Are there any elements in these books? I might have jumped. I don't know. Are there any elements in
No,
these
you
books
didn't.
that you would say have clashed with today's more in today's political or social climate? Things that might have been
There,
problematic.
there's one element that really stood out to me this time round that I actually didn't, I was completely oblivious to first time round, and that's Colgan and Meacham and how vague he is about the relationship. And obviously, the early 1980s wasn't exactly the time and the place you could write about a gay couple. So we had to be vague. We had to be very blasé about it. But it's very obvious. And I don't know how I didn't notice it the first time. But you look at it and go, oh God, I really wish you would have just been more open. But then you also have to think of the social environment of when he was writing it, and and even the politics around it. So many countries, it was still very not good. Like, it was still banned. Like in Ireland, it wasn't legal, I think, till the early 90s. So, but I think if it was written today, I think he probably would have written them a lot more open. And I think that would have been really lovely, because and I really hope in this supposed TV series that they're doing, that they really do that relationship justice, because I really want them to be this wonderfully happy couple. So that's the one thing that really stood for me.
That's bound to upset people watching if that happens, though, because they'll be like, that's not in the book. It's just because you didn't open your eyes.
It is in the book.
It's in the book. They didn't open their eyes.
It's in the book.
It's in the book.
Yeah.
Open your goddamn eyes. It's there.
It's right there.
Yeah.
For me, I think it was, like we said, a lot of the female characters were not given a whole lot of license, and they were sort of pushed to the side, and most of their POVs were not strongly written. It felt like the other characters were much more fleshed out, but all the female characters, it was more of a side note.
Yeah, but I think that's also down to the fact that at that point in time, he was not very good at writing female characters. He just didn't have the ability or the perspective to do it. So I think that's why they got sidelined so badly, and even got, the kind of stereotypical characterization. So, but I reckon if it was today, he probably would be a little bit better. I'd hope.
The gender thing, the thing with writing women, it was a big change, I would say, for me. When I first read it, it wasn't something I would have noticed, because I was a 14-year-old boy. I was Pug and Thomas at the time, so I really don't think that you would, and especially the time period when mid 80s, you just didn't get a lot of good female characters in fantasy. We didn't have many examples of that, at least in the more popular fantasy of the time.
Yeah. I think it's not really till the 90s where you start really getting the really strong female characters. And you get that with Robert Jordan, and then you get it with Garth Nix, and then obviously we get really strong female fantasy writers coming out, particularly in Australia in the noughties, with Trudy Canavan and a few others. And they start bringing out these really strong female characters, and it's great seeing that in fantasy. I mean, Lord of the Rings, it's like 9 blokes, you know.
It's a sausage fest, yes.
Yeah, it is.
With the the one token female character of Eowyn. I don't even count Arwen because she's not really there, and Galadriel's there for one chapter, and then she's gone. Eowyn was the only really female character we got.
Yeah, and Eowyn's a good character. You really, really get to feel for her, and she's really well written. So you got to give Tolkien a hands up for that one.
Yeah.
So
he did steal straight out of Shakespeare with her, though, a little bit.
This is true.
Yeah,
very I mean, doesn't everybody take from Shakespeare a little?
Well,
probably.
Studying literature in college, particularly when I was doing my children's literature module, along with my creative writing, we learned all about intertextuality. And basically that is everybody borrows from everybody. So there's no one book out there that someone hasn't picked something out of,
right,
and brought it in. Every single book ever written has an element of multiple other books in it.
And whether the author realizes they're doing it or not.
Exactly. And it's not plagiarism, it's just intertextualizing. You can even look at Raymond D. Feist himself, and you can see where he has intertextualized, everybody goes through mines, for God's sake.
Yeah.
It's right out of the Fellowship, and there's so many different things. They end up coming across the Wraith, which is like the Balrog. So,
what are themes or character flaws did you pick up on this time that you may have missed the first time?
I think we've already kind of covered it, haven't we, with the female characters and the per writing and the cliches and stuff like that with them. But yeah, that's really what kind of stood out for me with that.
For me, I think it was theme-wise. I absolutely picked up on the found family theme, particularly in Pug's storyline, where, even though he was an orphan, he had a found family to start with in the kitchens, and then, sort of readjusted with his friend Thomas. Of course, then he's taken capture and he gets that same thing with Lori. So I think found family is a big one, and he ends up, with a family. So
right, very much. They found him.
He even ends up a Condoin because he gets formally adopted by a family. So he's one of the luckiest people on the planet. Like he's constantly got people who want him to be a part of their life. So that's a great thing.
I was gonna bring up brotherhood, because there's the whole Thomas and Pug relationship. It's a really strong brotherhood. They were raised as brothers. You've got Arutha and Boric, and then we later find out Martin. That is in this one. Yeah, it's in this one.
Yeah, it is.
I wanted to make sure I didn't skip ahead to Silverthorn or Darkness of Sephinon. And there's even the brotherhood, a very broken brotherhood between Prince Erland and the king. Which king?
Roderick.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Roderick. Yeah.
Roderick the Mad.
Brotherhood is a major theme, I think. Even to some, like you pointed out, Pug and Lori, or Malambra and Lori. have a brotherhood, found family to. Any other themes that you guys picked up on this time around?
Yeah, I want to say it's not quite the horrors of war, but it's the internal structure of war is really
Okay.
focused on in the later half of the book. We're dealing with the politics of the Blue Circle faction going against the Warlord faction and things like that. And we get a chance to see how war is treated by this people in a political sense. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And sort of we get a little bit of the same thing on the other side where we get to see how they're dealing with the war. So we get to see more of the logistical and political sides of war.
Yeah. You don't really get to see the devastation of war. You don't see how it can create displacement or poverty or anything like that. So you never really hear anything about that. It just always sounds like it's just a battlefield and everybody's on the battlefield, but it's not always that in reality.
Right. He does gloss over some of the dirtier
Yeah.
aspects of warfare.
Well, yeah, I mean
But-
the last bit, that was brought on insanely, the whole betrayal thing with Macros. At the end they just sort of mentioned that 2,000 people died and there were probably at least 1,000 that were injured and not going to make it through the night, but it's pretty glossed over for more of the settling the political situation for now.
Right.
It's
Which-
like with the actual Serrani, the 4,000, like he's like, oh, there's 4,000 of them. Well, he doesn't make it feel like there's actually 4,000 of them, if you get me.
Yeah.
So it's just like there was just 4,000.
And
And
I think
let's move
that's-
on.
Yeah, I think that might be a bit emblematic of the time period it was written in. I mean, Tolkien didn't do any of that either,
No, he
Tolkien
didn't.
doesn't we do see some displacement in the books at the end with the Scouring of the
Yeah,
Shire.
and you see a little bit in the Two Towers, but
with
not
the Rohirrim.
yeah, but not
But
really.
it's left out a lot,
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the reader at that time. I don't think we were ready for the, more grimdark sort of stuff where they go into descriptions of the horror of the battle and limbs
Right.
cut off and gore and all that stuff. I don't think audience were in the right frame of mind for that thing when this was written. I mean, could he
Probably.
take it that direction if he were to rewrite it today? Absolutely. Tell it from a soldier's point of view, a couple scenes that are just horrifically dark.
Well, at the same time, not everything has to be Malazan, which
No,
that's
agreed.
one of the big things it's about. Malazan books are about is the horrors of war. I mean, just the absolute utter horror that warfare can inflict upon a people.
Well, that can get exhausting.
Yeah.
When it's constant, you need a break.
Yes.
You need some
You need
to find balance.
sunshine.
There
Yeah.
has
That's
to
why
be
I
a
divide
balance.
up all my Malazan books. I'm putting books between those just because it gets too heavy to read back to back to back to back. At least for me, I like it when I can get a little bit fluff, at times. And I'm not trying to call the Riftwar stuff fluff, but compared to some of the stuff that's on the market today, it is fluff.
Yeah.
And it's not intended to be that.
But it's well
you know.
done fluff. So I absolutely loved it. So I'm
Well,
all right with that.
During its period in time when it was written, even up until the point of time where I read it, it would have been exceptional in the fantasy writing world. But obviously writing has come a lot further from then, and a lot more gets added into books. Maybe it's because it's easier to research things nowadays with the internet and online archive systems and whatnot than it was 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that could also be an element that could make it different for writers now and more easier in a way for them to be able to be battle ready. Especially when you look at the, spoiler alert, the last battle in Wheel of Time, and you learn how that is literally picked out of it's literally a real battle in history that he has gone and used and plunked in.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and the access by then to so much would have been there. Maybe it was a lot harder. Maybe, as you said, it just wasn't what people wanted. But at the same time, Raymond Feist in 1982 bringing out Magician, that must have felt kind of revolutionary in the fantasy world, especially when you look at the series of books that had been dominating the market up until then, you know, the ones
Right.
that were
Definitely.
the popular ones. It's a change, it's giving a whole different element. There's different worlds. You can slice a rift in space and time, which obviously then influences his dark materials, where you can literally slice a rift in space and
Reality.
time. So
Right.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
definitely sneakily one of the more influential books out there, I think, in a lot of ways, because I hadn't thought of the connection to the Pullman stuff until you mentioned
Yeah.
it just now. But
intertextuality, you
Yeah.
just don't know it's there until you go and look.
yeah, would you recommend this book to older readers, our age or older, and or would you recommend it to younger readers,
I would
or just
recommend
one
it
of the
to
two?
both, all of them. I think it's appealable for a young mature reading audience, so teenager audience, because it's not full of the blood and gore and guts and stuff the same way the Lord of the Rings isn't, and we learn
Right.
it, we start reading it in school when we're 11, you know. But also I would say for adults to read it as well, because it is just quality epic high fantasy, and I think everybody should at least read it once, especially if they're
Agreed.
a lover of fantasy books.
Yeah.
It's a very the fantasy market and world now is so much bigger than it was in the past. There is an awful lot for people to pick and choose from. You know, there's so many subgenres now that you just never would have dreamt of 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
But I think for anyone who loves fantasy, the Lord of the Rings books, the Rift War books, and even the Shannara Chronicles, in my opinion, are series of books that people should make sure that they have read.
I would say the first 6 Feist books, you know, the Rift War
Yeah.
Saga trilogy and the Empire trilogy, at
Yeah,
least
yeah.
everybody should give a shot at.
Yeah.
Going past those, I mean, there's some great books after those. I really like the Serpent War trilogy, or I don't even think it's a trilogy, Serpent War Saga, which
I
is like the
loved
3rd or
the
4th.
I have a secret love for the King's Buccaneer, and I know it's one of possibly the least popular books, but I loved it.
It was a
And
good
I
one.
remember loving it.
It's been a while since I read that one, or Prince of the Blood. Princes of the Blood?
Prince
Whatever.
of the Blood. Hang on. Prince of the Blood. That's just
Prince
there.
of the Blood.
See,
Yeah, and that
I didn't
was
go
what-
past the first 3, so I am in for some fun.
Yeah, and that was back when
Oh.
Feist at one point had said he wasn't going to write anything more in Mid-Camia. And then Prince of the Blood comes out, the King's Buccaneer comes out, and then next thing I know, like every couple of years, he had a new book.
Yeah, and then before you know it, there's like 30 books in the series, you know?
And I've still yet to read that 30th one, because it's not even a novel. It's like a coffee table book about, what is it, Mid-Camia, the Chronicles of Pug, or something like that.
Yeah. I would like to eventually read all of them, but like Shannara, I kind of stopped at a point. I think I got through more Shannara books than I have Raymond D. Feist books, even though I think Feist is the more superior writer.
There are more Shannara books that I haven't read than I have read at this point.
I wanted to set up my own bookshop. I wanted to set up a little bookshop dedicated to science fiction and fantasy novels,
I would love to do
from
that.
children's to adults books. And I actually wanted to call it Midkemia Books.
Nice.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's how much I was in love with Feist at the time. I was writing at the time. I went
I can
around going,
understand
Feist is
that.
my favorite author. So I actually wanted to name a science fiction fantasy bookshop Midkemia Books. So
See,
that's a little tricky.
He's one of my favorite authors, but I'll say this about Midkemia. Midkemia is definitely my comfort read. As much as I've read other books more, like I've spent way more time reading Wheel of Time, just reading Wheel of Time, than I have reading anything by Feist. When I need to curl up with a cozy book or get over some depression or sadness or calm down from being angry, it's something in Midkemia that I quite often pick up and will just curl up and nowadays listen, but curl up and read, over the course of a day or two. And quite often I would read his new books in the course of 2 days, whenever he would put out a new one.
I think for me that would be Garth Nix, Sabriel, Lyriel, Aporson, those books. They're like one of my comfort books. I just love them. I just find them amazing.
Yeah,
He's
for
on my
me,
list.
Go to.
for
What's
me,
that?
it's Stephen King's The Stand. Yeah, that big,
an
huge
interesting
book,
one.
that is my comfort book.
That's
At
like
least on
turning
the
around
audio.
and saying,
Understand
my comfort book is War and Peace. It's huge.
I don't know.
Hey,
It
at
just,
last, you got a lot of comfort there.
I know the characters, and it's
Yeah.
like slipping on old comfortable slippers. It's just
Yeah.
beautiful.
Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on Magician by Raymond D. Feist?
Well, just that people should read it.
Read it.
That's
Yeah.
all. Just
Definitely.
read it.
It does hold up.
Absolutely.
It
holds
does.
up
It
better
hasn't.
than any of the Rift or the Dragonlance stuff we read. At least for me, it does.
Yeah, me as well.
I think it hasn't aged. It's something that, like the Lord of the Rings, should still be readable in like 10, 15, 20 years time and not age. And I think that's down to the fact that it's everything's so historical. The way he's used, like his worlds are basically bits and elements out of different parts of history, and I think that makes it a bit timeless. So the book itself is very easy to read. It hasn't had any issues with aging, and I think it's just brilliant.
I have to say, overall, for me, it's just definitely read this, give this a shot. If you haven't tried reading it.
I think we had a nice chat. Anything else anybody wants to bring up? Thank you, Nyniamh, for joining us and educating the American public on how to pronounce names.
Yeah, Irish names, the most annoyingly awkward spellings and pronounced names on the planet.
Well, thank you guys at home for watching. Thank you, Nyniamh, for joining us. And thank you,
very
Bill,
much
for
for
doing this
having
show with me. You guys at home for watching. Please come back next time as we continue with Raymond E. Feist. We'll be doing Silverthorn, Book 2.
Yep.
And don't forget to be awesome.